The sound of a gavel striking wood echoed across the dusty square of Cripple Creek, Colorado, as Ruth Wilson stood on the auction block, her scarred hands bound before her, face downcast beneath the scorching July sun of 1875. The crowd of miners, ranchers, and townspeople gathered around, their eyes scrutinizing her like she was nothing more than livestock at a county fair. Her once delicate fingers were now a web of raised, reddened scars, a permanent reminder of the fire that had taken everything from her. Next up, one female worker. 25 years old, contract for sale to pay off family debts, announced the auctioneer, a portly man whose voice carried across the square with practiced efficiency. He deliberately avoided mentioning her hands, which were clearly visible to all. Opening bid at $20, the crowd murmured. Many gazes dropped to her scarred hands, and several potential bidders shook their heads and turned away. $15. Someone finally called out, a tavern owner known for working his help to the bone. Ruth's heart sank. She knew what awaited her there: endless scrubbing, washing, and abuse. Her hands throbbed just thinking about it, the tender scars stretched tightly across her knuckles. 15 going once. A tall figure moved through the crowd. Broad-shouldered and sun-bronzed, his boots kicked up little clouds of dust as he strode forward. Yancy Caldwell was not a man who frequented human auctions. The owner of the Broken Spur Ranch outside of town, he generally kept to himself except for cattle sales and the occasional supply run. 15 going twice. $50, Yancy called out, his deep voice silencing the crowd. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. $50 from Mr. Caldwell. Do I hear 60? The tavern owner scowled but shook his head. No one else spoke up. Sold. To Mr. Caldwell for $50. As Yancy approached the auction block to complete the transaction, Ruth raised her eyes to meet his for the first time. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with a strong jawline partially hidden beneath a neatly trimmed beard. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, deep blue and surprisingly gentle as they assessed her. The auctioneer handed him her contract papers, his voice lowered but still audible to Ruth. Figured you'd want a housekeeper for that big ranch house, but I should warn you those hands aren't much use anymore. Yancy looked directly at Ruth's scarred hands before meeting her gaze again. Those hands will never work again, he stated firmly, his voice carrying to those nearby. Ruth's stomach twisted with despair. If he wouldn't let her work, what purpose did he have in buying her contract? The clerk completed the transaction, and Ruth was led down from the platform, still trying to understand what fate awaited her. As they walked away from the crowd, Yancy untied the rough rope binding her wrists. "My wagon's over there," he said, nodding toward a sturdy buckboard hitched to 2 chestnut horses. "Can you climb up on your own?" Ruth nodded silently, still wary of his intentions. "I'm Yancy Caldwell," he said as he helped her settle on the wooden seat. "My ranch is about 10 miles outside of town." "Ruth Wilson," she replied softly, her first word since being brought to the auction block. "Miss Wilson, I want to make something clear," Yancy said as he gathered the reins. "When I said your hands won't work again, I meant they won't work for others. Not like that." He nodded toward the auction block they were leaving behind. No one should be worked like a mule because of debts they didn't choose. Relief flooded through her, but confusion remained. "Then why did you buy my contract, Mr. Caldwell?" "Let's just say I've got my reasons," he replied, flicking the reins to set the horses in motion. "For now, you'll have a safe place to heal. Beyond that, we'll figure it out as we go." As they left Cripple Creek behind, Ruth gazed at the vast expanse of land stretching before them, golden under the afternoon sun. For the first time in months, she felt something stir within her chest, not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. The journey to Broken Spur Ranch passed mostly in silence. Ruth watched as the landscape changed from the scattered buildings of Cripple Creek to open meadows and stands of pine trees. The mountain air grew cooler as they climbed, and she pulled her threadbare shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "Cold?" Yancy asked, noticing her movement. "A little," she admitted. Without hesitation, he stopped the wagon and reached behind the seat, pulling out a worn but clean blanket. "Here. The evenings can get chilly, even in summer." The simple kindness nearly brought tears to her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had shown her consideration. "Thank you," she murmured, wrapping the blanket around herself. "We're almost there," he said, urging the horses forward again. Just beyond that ridge. When they crested the hill, Ruth caught her first glimpse of Broken Spur Ranch. A large two-story house stood proudly in a clearing, with a barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings nearby. Several corrals held horses, and in the distance, cattle grazed on the rolling pastures. It was substantial, far larger than she had expected. "You manage all this yourself?" she asked, genuinely curious. Yancy gave a short laugh. "No, madam. I've got 5 ranch hands who help with the cattle and horses, but they stay in the bunkhouse. The main house has been, well, neglected since my mother passed 3 years ago." As they approached the house, Ruth noticed a woman emerge from the front door, stout and gray-haired, with a no-nonsense expression that softened when she spotted the wagon. "That's Mrs. Abernathy," Yancy explained. "She comes from town twice a week to cook and do some cleaning. Good woman, but she's getting on in years and can't manage it all anymore." The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house, and Yancy jumped down, coming around to help Ruth descend. Mrs. Abernathy approached, her curious gaze taking in Ruth's worn dress and scarred hands. "Martha, this is Miss Ruth Wilson. She'll be staying with us," Yancy said simply. The older woman's eyebrows rose slightly, but she quickly composed herself. "Welcome to Broken Spur, Miss Wilson. I've prepared the guest room upstairs, and there's stew for supper." "Thank you," Ruth replied softly. "Show her up, would you?" Yancy asked Mrs. Abernathy. "I need to see to the horses." As Ruth followed Mrs. Abernathy into the house, she couldn't help but wonder what exactly her position here would be. Not a worker, according to Yancy, but then what? The inside of the ranch house surprised her. Though clearly in need of a woman's touch, it was solidly built and comfortably furnished. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, with a worn leather sofa and several chairs arranged before it. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that suggested Yancy Caldwell was more educated than the average rancher. "The master's a good man," Mrs. Abernathy said as they climbed the stairs. "Keeps to himself mostly, but fair to everyone who works for him." "Why did he buy my contract?" Ruth asked. "If not for work," Mrs. Abernathy gave her a sidelong glance, "that's for him to say. But I will tell you this: Yancy Caldwell doesn't do anything without reason." She stopped at a door and pushed it open. "Here's your room. There's water in the pitcher for washing, and I'll bring up some of my daughter's old dresses tomorrow. They might be a bit large, but they'll do until we can get you properly fitted." The room was simply furnished with a bed, dresser, and washstand, but it was clean and pleasant, with a window overlooking the mountains to the west. After months of sleeping in crowded boarding houses or jail cells while awaiting auction, it seemed like unimaginable luxury. "Supper's in an hour," Mrs. Abernathy said, leaving Ruth alone with her thoughts. Ruth sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingertips over the clean quilt. The scars pulled and tightened with the movement, a constant reminder of what she had lost. She had been a skilled seamstress once, her nimble fingers creating delicate embroidery that ladies in Denver had paid handsomely for. Now, she could barely button her own dress without pain, After washing her face and trying to make herself presentable, Ruth made her way downstairs. She found Yancy in the main room, studying a ledger at a large oak desk. He looked up when she entered, closing the book. "Feeling better after your journey?" he asked. "Yes, thank you." She remained standing awkwardly by the doorway. "Mr. Caldwell, I feel I must ask again, why did you buy my contract? What do you expect of me?" He gestured to a nearby chair. "Please sit down." When she had settled herself, he leaned forward, his expression serious. "Miss Wilson, 3 months ago, I was in Denver on business. There was a fire at a boarding house, I assume the same one where you were injured." Ruth's breath caught. "You were there," he nodded. "I helped pull some folks out. I remember seeing a young woman being carried away, her hands badly burned after she'd gone back in to save a child." His eyes found hers. "That was you, wasn't it?" She lowered her gaze to her scarred hands. "The little boy was the son of my friend. His mother had gone out for work and he was sleeping when the fire started. I couldn't leave him." "You saved his life," Yancy said quietly. "Yes. But I lost everything else. My sewing tools, my fabrics, all my savings. When I couldn't work anymore because of my hands, I couldn't pay my debts or my friends' medical bills. They sent me here to be auctioned off. I recognized you today," he admitted. "Didn't expect to find you on an auction block in Cripple Creek, but sometimes fate has strange ways. So you bought my contract out of pity." The word tasted bitter on her tongue. "Respect," he corrected firmly. "What you did took courage." "I don't believe courage should be rewarded with servitude." Before Ruth could respond, Mrs. Abernathy appeared in the doorway. "Supper's ready," she announced. Over a hearty beef stew and fresh bread, Yancy explained more about the ranch, the cattle operation, the horses he bred, and the challenges of ranching in the high country. "We've been expanding," he said, "which means more paperwork. Records, correspondence, supply orders. My hands are better with ropes than pens." "Is that what you want from me?" Ruth asked. "To help with your records, if you're willing. Your hands may not be suited for heavy work anymore, but your mind is sound, and I suspect you had some education." She nodded. "My father was a school teacher before he died. He taught me well." "Good. We'll start tomorrow if you're agreeable. Just a few hours each day until you're settled." He paused, adding, "Your contract is for 1 year, Miss Wilson. But I want you to understand something. I don't consider you bound by it. If at any time you wish to leave, you're free to go." Ruth stared at him, astonished. "But you paid for my contract." "I paid to free you from that auction block," he corrected. "Not to own your labor or your time." After supper, Ruth helped Mrs. Abernathy clear the dishes, despite the older woman's protests. Her scarred hands made her clumsy, but she was determined to be useful in some way. Later, as she lay in bed listening to the unfamiliar night sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft hooting of an owl, the whisper of pine trees in the breeze, Ruth tried to make sense of her strange new circumstances. Yancy Caldwell was unlike any man she had ever met. His kindness seemed genuine, his expectations reasonable, yet experience had taught her that kindness often came with hidden costs. As she drifted toward sleep, she wondered what price she might eventually be asked to pay for her newfound safety. The first week at Broken Spur passed in a blur of new routines. Each morning, Ruth would join Yancy for breakfast before spending a few hours in his study, organizing correspondence and updating ledgers. Her handwriting, once flowing and elegant, had become stiff and labored since the fire, but she was determined to improve. In the afternoons, she often sat on the wide front porch, resting her hands and watching the activities of the ranch unfold before her. She slowly began to meet the ranch hand's Eduardo, a skilled Mexican horseman who had been with Yancy for years. brothers Tom and Will Jackson, who handled most of the cattle work, young Jamie Cooper, barely 20 and eager to learn, and Samuel, an older black man who had fought in the Union Army and now served as the ranch's foreman. Samuel, in particular, treated Ruth with a quiet courtesy that put her at ease. "Mr. Caldwell's a fair boss," he told her one afternoon as he mended tack on the porch while she rested in a rocking chair. "Doesn't care about a man's color or where he comes from, just how hard he works and how honest he is." "How long have you worked for him?" Ruth asked. "Going on 8 years now. Came west after the war looking for a fresh start." "Not many would hire a black man as foreman, but Mr. Caldwell judged me on my skills with cattle and men." He glanced at her scarred hands. "He sees people for who they are, not just what they can do for him." On the 7th day, after the ranch hands had ridden out and Mrs. Abernathy had returned to town, Ruth found herself alone in the house with Yancy for the first time. She was in the kitchen, awkwardly attempting to make tea when he appeared in the doorway. "Need some help with that?" he asked. "I can manage," she insisted, though the kettle wobbled dangerously in her grip. Yancy stepped forward anyway, taking the kettle and filling it with water. "There's no shame in accepting help, Miss Wilson." "Ruth," she said suddenly. "Please call me Ruth. Miss Wilson makes me feel like I'm still standing on that auction block." He nodded, setting the kettle on the stove. "Ruth it is. And I'm Yancy, not Mr. Caldwell, at least when it's just us talking." As they waited for the water to boil, Ruth found herself studying him more closely than she had dared before. Without his usual hat, his dark hair showed hints of auburn in the sunlight streaming through the window. A small scar crossed his left eyebrow, and laugh lines framed his eyes despite his serious demeanor. "You're wondering about my story," he said, catching her gaze. Ruth flushed, embarrassed at being so transparent. "Everyone has one. Mine's not very exciting. Born in Pennsylvania. Father died in the war when I was 15. Mother and I came west afterwards, settled here, built this place up from almost nothing." He paused. "Lost her to pneumonia 3 winters ago." "I'm sorry," Ruth said sincerely. "It's hard to lose family." "Your parents are gone too," she nodded. "Father 5 years ago, mother last year. It was after she died that I moved to Denver, hoping to make a living with my needlework." The kettle began to whistle, and Yancy moved to pour the hot water into the teapot Ruth had prepared. "You were good at it. Your sewing?" he asked. "Very good," she said without false modesty. "I specialized in fine embroidery. Ladies would bring me their best dresses and linens for embellishment." She looked down at her hands. "Now I can barely hold a needle." "Have you tried since the fire?" "A little. The doctor in Denver said I might regain more function with time and practice, but it's painful and She hesitated. "I'm afraid of failing." Yancy considered her thoughtfully as he set the tea to steep. "I broke my leg badly a few years back. Horse rolled over on me during a roundup. Doctor said I might always walk with a limp." Ruth glanced down, noticing for the first time a slight unevenness in his stance. "I do still limp, especially when the weather changes," he continued. "But I kept at it little by little, found my own way of doing things." He poured the tea into 2 cups, handing one to her. "Perhaps you need to find your way too. Different from before, but still yours." His words stayed with Ruth throughout the day, and that evening she asked Mrs. Abernathy if there might be any sewing supplies in the house. "In the chest in the sitting room," the housekeeper replied. "The master's mother was quite handy with a needle, God rest her soul." The chest contained a treasure trove of supplies, needles of various sizes, threads in rainbow hues, scraps of fine fabric, embroidery hoops, and even delicate silver scissors. Ruth's heart quickened at the sight of them, memories of happier days flooding back. After everyone had retired for the night, she sat by the lamp in her room, a small piece of muslin stretched in a hoop. Her first attempts were clumsy, the stitches uneven, and pain soon forced her to stop. But a tiny spark had been lit, not quite hope, but determination. Each night after that, she practiced for a little longer, trying different ways of holding the needle, different positions to reduce the strain on her damaged fingers. Progress was slow and often discouraging, but she persisted. 2 weeks after her arrival at Broken Spur, Ruth was sitting on the porch with her embroidery when Yancy returned from checking the north pasture. He dismounted, handed his horse to Jamie, and walked toward the house, stopping short when he noticed what she was doing. "You're sewing," he observed, climbing the steps to get a better look. Ruth held up the hoop. The design was simple, just a small cluster of wildflowers, and the stitches weren't as precise as they once would have been, but the work was unmistakably skilled. "It's not my best," she said. "But it's a start." Yancy studied it, genuine admiration in his eyes. "It's beautiful." Something warm unfurled in Ruth's chest at his praise, a feeling she quickly tried to suppress. Becoming attached to this place, to this man, would be dangerous. Her situation was temporary, regardless of Yancy's assurances about her freedom. The debt that had put her on that auction block still existed, and eventually she would have to face that reality. "Ruth," Yancy said, interrupting her thoughts, "there's a social in town on Saturday. The summer harvest dance. Would you care to attend? Might do you good to meet some of the local folks." The invitation startled her. I don't have anything suitable to wear," she said, the first excuse that came to mind. "Mrs. Abernathy mentioned she'd been altering some dresses for you." "Yes, but they're just everyday dresses, not something for a dance." Yancy considered this problem. "There's a trunk of my mother's things in the attic. She was about your size. Perhaps something there might suit." The idea of wearing his dead mother's clothing felt strange, but Ruth couldn't deny her desire to escape the ranch, if only for an evening. "If you're sure you wouldn't mind." "I'm sure she'd be pleased for them to be used rather than gathering dust," he said, his tone gentle. The next day, Mrs. Abernathy helped Ruth search through the trunk. Among the carefully packed garments, they found a dress of deep blue silk, simply cut but elegant. "This was one of her favorites," Mrs. Abernathy said, holding it up. "She wore it to church on special Sundays. I think it would suit you, with your dark hair and fair skin." The dress required minimal alteration, which Mrs. Abernathy handled expertly. When Ruth tried it on the morning of the dance, the older woman stepped back with satisfaction. "You look lovely, dear. The master will be pleased." Ruth flushed. "It's not about pleasing him. He's just being kind, taking me to town." Mrs. Abernathy gave her a knowing look but said nothing more. When Ruth descended the stairs that evening, Yancy was waiting in the front hall, dressed in his best clothes, a dark suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His usually unruly hair neatly combed, his boots polished to a shine. He stared at her for a long moment before speaking. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," she replied, fighting another blush. "It's your mother's dress. I hope you don't mind." She would have been honored, he assured her, offering his arm. "The buggy's ready whenever you are." The ride to Cripple Creek took nearly an hour, and Ruth found herself growing nervous as they approached the town. She hadn't been back since the day of the auction, and the thought of facing those same townspeople as Yancy Caldwell's. What? Guest? Employee? The uncertainty of her position suddenly felt overwhelming. Having second thoughts, Yancy asked, noticing her silence. "People will talk," she said. "About why you bought my contract, about what I'm doing at your ranch," he shrugged. "People always talk. Best not to give them too much power over your happiness." The dance was being held in the town hall, a sturdy building at the center of Cripple Creek. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the assembled townspeople. A small band played lively tunes in one corner, while tables laden with food and drink lined the opposite wall. As they entered, Ruth felt the weight of curious stares. Yancy's hand at the small of her back steadied her, guiding her through the crowd to greet the hosts, the mayor and his wife. "Mr. Caldwell, so glad you could join us," the mayor boomed. His gaze shifted to Ruth, curiosity evident. "And who is your lovely companion?" "This is Miss Ruth Wilson," Yancy replied evenly. "She's recently come to work at Broken Spur." The mayor's wife's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh. In what capacity, may I ask?" "Miss Wilson is helping me organize my accounts and correspondence," Yancy said, his tone discouraging further questions. "She's exceptionally well educated." This simple statement, delivered with such matter-of-fact confidence, did much to establish Ruth's position in the eyes of those listening. Not a housekeeper or cook, not a woman of questionable virtue, but a sort of secretary or assistant, unusual but respectable. As the evening progressed, Ruth found herself cautiously enjoying the festivities. Several of the town's women approached her, curious but generally welcoming. She danced once with Samuel, who had accompanied them to town, and once with the elderly doctor who had treated Yancy's leg after his accident. "He's a good man, Caldwell," the doctor told her as they moved carefully around the floor. "Stubborn as a mule, but good-hearted. Been alone too long, if you ask me." Ruth wasn't sure how to respond to this, so she simply smiled and changed the subject. Later, as the band struck up a waltz, Yancy appeared at her side. "May I have this dance?" he asked formally. She hesitated, lifting her scarred hand slightly. "I'm not sure I can. We'll go slowly," he promised, "and if it hurts too much, we'll stop." His left hand took her right one gently, while his other hand rested lightly at her waist. The contact sent a surprising warmth through her, even as she worried about her ability to follow his lead. But Yancy moved with unexpected grace despite his slight limp, guiding her so smoothly that her awkwardness faded. They weren't the most polished couple on the floor, but there was something right about the way they fit together, compensating for each other's limitations. "See," he murmured, his voice low near her ear. "We just needed to find our own way." Ruth looked up at him, struck by the parallel to what he had said about her sewing. Their eyes met, and for a breathless moment the crowded room seemed to fade away. Then someone bumped into them, breaking the spell, and Ruth quickly looked down, her heart racing with confusion. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur. On the journey home, the buggy's lantern cast just enough light for Ruth to see Yancy's profile as he drove. The steady clop of the horse's hooves and the chirp of crickets filled the comfortable silence between them. "Thank you," she said finally, "for taking me tonight. It was nice to feel normal again." He glanced at her, his expression soft in the dim light. "You're welcome. And for what it's worth, you charmed half the town. The other half are just too stubborn to admit it." Ruth smiled, warmed by his words. But as the ranch house came into view, her smile faded. What was happening between them couldn't lead anywhere. She was still bound by her contract, still carrying debts that would eventually come due. And Yancy Caldwell, for all his kindness, was her employer, not a potential suitor. She needed to remember that before her heart led her somewhere painful. Summer gave way to autumn, painting the aspen groves around Broken Spur in brilliant gold. Ruth had been at the ranch for nearly 3 months, and a comfortable routine had developed. Her mornings were spent helping Yancy with his paperwork, her afternoons working on her embroidery or assisting Mrs. Abernathy. Her hands, while still scarred, had grown stronger and more flexible with daily use. One crisp October morning, Yancy found her in the study, frowning over a supply inventory. "Something wrong?" he asked. "These numbers don't match what we have in the storeroom," she explained. "We should have 15 sacks of grain, but I only counted 12 yesterday." Yancy leaned over her shoulder to examine the ledger, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap and the outdoors that always clung to him. "That's strange. I'll have Samuel check if any were moved to the barn." His proximity made it hard for Ruth to concentrate. These moments of awareness had been happening more frequently, a lingering glance over dinner, his hand helping her down from the wagon, staying just a heartbeat too long on her waist. Small things that she tried to dismiss but couldn't quite forget. "There's something else," she said, forcing herself back to business. "The cattle sale proceeds from last month. They seem lower than they should be given the number of head you sold." Yancy's expression darkened. "Let me see that." He studied the figures, his frown deepening. "You're right. This is almost $200 short of what we agreed on." "Could it be a simple error?" Ruth suggested. "Or Baldwin trying to cheat me again," Yancy muttered. "He's done it before, counting on the fact that most ranchers don't check their figures too carefully." He straightened, his decision made. "I need to ride into town, talk to Baldwin directly." "I'll come with you," Ruth said impulsively. "I can show him exactly where the discrepancies are." Yancy considered her offer. "It might be helpful to have you there. Your memory for numbers is better than mine." He paused. "But Baldwin can be unpleasant when confronted. Are you sure?" "I'm not afraid of unpleasant men, Yancy. I've met plenty." The ride to town was beautiful, the road winding through groves of aspen trees whose leaves trembled like golden coins in the breeze. Ruth had become a competent rider in the months since her arrival, though she still preferred the stability of the wagon for longer journeys. Cripple Creek had grown familiar to her now. She accompanied Yancy or Mrs. Abernathy to town regularly for supplies and had gradually been accepted by most of the townspeople. There were still a few who remembered her auction and looked at her with distaste, but most had moved on to fresher gossip. Baldwin's office was above the general store, a cramped space that smelled of tobacco and dust. The cattle buyer was a heavyset man with small, calculating eyes and a perpetual sheen of sweat on his forehead. His expression soured when he saw Yancy enter, and darkened further when Ruth followed. "Caldwell," he acknowledged curtly. "What brings you to town?" "Discrepancies in our accounts," Yancy replied without preamble. "The payment for last month's cattle drive is short by nearly $200. Baldwin's eyes narrowed. "My figures show I paid you exactly what we agreed." "Your figures are wrong," Ruth interjected, stepping forward and placing the ledger on his desk. "According to the contract, you agreed to pay $35 per head for 67 cattle. That's $2,345. You paid only $2,150. Baldwin stared at her, clearly not expecting such precise accounting from a woman. "There must have been fewer cattle than counted. It happens in the confusion of a drive." "The count was verified by your own man," Ruth countered, pointing to the signed receipt. "Right here with his signature. 67 head received in good condition." Baldwin's face flushed red. "Now see here." "No, you see here, Baldwin," Yancy cut in, his voice deceptively calm. "You've tried this before, and I let it go. Not this time. You can pay me what you owe, or we can take this to the sheriff, and I'll make sure every rancher in the county knows exactly how you do business." The threat of public exposure seemed to register with Baldwin. His small eyes darted between Yancy's impassive face and Ruth's determined one. "There might have been an error in calculation," he conceded grudgingly. "I'll have my clerk review the figures." "Do it now," Yancy insisted. 20 minutes later, they emerged from the office with a bank draft for the missing amount. As they walked down the street toward the bank to deposit it, Yancy gave Ruth an approving look. "You were impressive in there. I've never seen Baldwin back down so quickly." Ruth smiled, pleased by his praise but trying not to show how much it affected her. Numbers don't lie, and neither did his clerk's face when I pointed out the error. Their business at the bank concluded, they decided to have lunch at the hotel before returning to the ranch. The dining room was nearly empty at that hour, and they were shown to a quiet table near the window. "Have you thought about what you'll do when your contract is up?" Yancy asked suddenly as they waited for their food. The question caught Ruth off guard. She had been at Broken Spur for 3 months, which meant 9 months remained on her contract. In truth, she had been avoiding thinking about the future, finding it easier to live in the present at the ranch. "Not specifically," she admitted. "I suppose I should start saving, try to rebuild what I lost." "Your embroidery is excellent again," he observed. "Nearly as good as before from what I can see. You could sell your work." "Perhaps," she agreed, "but I need to find customers, establish myself somewhere." Yancy seemed about to say something more when a commotion at the hotel entrance caught their attention. A well-dressed man had entered, followed by 2 rough-looking companions. The hotel manager greeted them with obvious deference. Ruth felt the blood drain from her face. "Oh no," she whispered. "What is it?" Yancy asked, immediately alert. "Do you know that man, Elliot Parker?" she said, her voice barely audible. "He's the creditor who arranged for my contract to be sold. He owns a bank in Denver." Yancy's expression hardened. "What's he doing in Cripple Creek?" "I don't know. His bank has investments throughout Colorado, but—" She swallowed hard. "Yancy, if he sees me, he might try to claim I've broken contract by not working as intended. The auction terms specified labor." "You are working," Yancy said firmly, "just not breaking your back or your hands in the process. Your contract was legally transferred to me, and I get to decide how you fulfill it." Before Ruth could respond, Parker's gaze swept the dining room and landed on their table. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by surprise, and then calculation. He excused himself from the hotel manager and approached their table. "Miss Wilson," he said, his cultured voice at odds with the coldness of his eyes. "What an unexpected pleasure." Ruth didn't stand or offer her hand. "Mr. Parker, I was under the impression you were contracted for labor in Cripple Creek, yet here you are, dining at the hotel like a lady of leisure." His gaze shifted to Yancy. "And who might this be?" "Yancy Caldwell," Yancy replied, standing to his full height, which put him several inches above Parker. "I purchased Miss Wilson's contract at auction." Parker raised an eyebrow. "Did you indeed? And what sort of work does she do for you, Mr. Caldwell?" The insinuation was clear, and Ruth felt heat rise to her cheeks, partly from embarrassment, partly from anger. "Miss Wilson manages my accounts and correspondence," Yancy stated coldly. "She's exceptionally talented with figures, as you might remember from your dealings with her in Denver." Parker's smile didn't reach his eyes. "How convenient for her. Those scarred hands wouldn't be much use for actual labor, would they? I do hope you didn't overpay." Yancy's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "I consider it the best investment I've made this year." "Well, I'm pleased to hear she's found a way to be useful." Parker's gaze returned to Ruth. "Your contracted debt remains substantial, Miss Wilson. I trust you're setting aside funds to address it when your year of service concludes." "My financial planning is no longer your concern, Mr. Parker," Ruth replied, finding her voice at last. "The contract transferred all rights to Mr. Caldwell for the duration. Indeed it did, but when it expires—" He let the implication hang in the air. "Well, I should let you return to your meal. Good day to you both." As Parker walked away to join his companions, Ruth's appetite vanished. "I'm sorry," she said quietly to Yancy. I didn't expect him to be here. Don't apologize, Yancy replied, his eyes still following Parker across the room. What did he mean about your contracted debt remaining substantial? Ruth sighed. The auction price only covered the interest on my debt, not the principal. When my year of service ends, I'll still owe him nearly all of the original amount, over $500. Yancy's expression darkened. That's highway robbery. No wonder these debt contracts are so controversial. It was the only way I could avoid debtor's prison after the fire, Ruth explained. I had no family to help, no assets to sell. Their food arrived, but neither had much interest in eating. As they picked at their meals, Yancy seemed deep in thought. We should head back to the ranch, he said finally. I don't like the way Parker was looking at you. The ride home was quieter than their journey into town. Ruth's mind raced with worries about Parker's appearance in Cripple Creek and what it might mean for her future. The brief respite she had found at Broken Spur suddenly felt precarious. As they approached the ranch, Yancy finally broke the silence. Ruth, I want you to know something. As long as you're under my roof, you're safe. Parker can't touch you while your contract is in my name. But it's only for 9 more months, she reminded him. Then I'm right back where I started. Yancy reined the horses to a stop, turning to face her fully. No, not where you started. You're stronger now. Your hands are healing. You're skilled with numbers and getting back your embroidery talents. And? He hesitated, then continued more softly, and you have people who care about you. You're not alone anymore. The sincerity in his voice made her throat tight with emotion. Thank you, she managed to say, for everything. His hand covered hers briefly, warm and reassuring, before he picked up the reins again. As they continued toward home, Ruth tried to focus on the present rather than her fears for the future. 9 months was a long time. Perhaps, somehow, a solution would present itself. Winter descended on the Colorado mountains with a fierce determination, transforming Broken Spur Ranch into a wonderland of white. Deep snow drifted against the buildings, and icicles hung like crystal daggers from the eaves. Inside the ranch house, fires burned constantly in the hearths, and the scent of pine boughs decorated for Christmas filled the air. Ruth had been at the ranch for 6 months now, and in that time, it had become more of a home than any place she'd known since her parents died. Her hands, while still bearing the marks of her injuries, had regained much of their former dexterity. Her embroidery work had improved so significantly that she had begun selling pieces through the general store in Cripple Creek, carefully saving every penny toward her debt. But it was the change in her relationship with Yancy that marked the greatest transformation. Since their encounter with Parker, something had shifted between them. There was a new awareness, an unspoken current of feeling that neither seemed ready to acknowledge openly. They spent their evenings together by the fire, Ruth with her embroidery, Yancy reading aloud from one of his many books. Sometimes they simply talked, sharing stories from their pasts or discussing the day's events at the ranch. In those quiet moments, Ruth found herself studying his face, memorizing the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed or how his fingers absently turned the pages of his book. She knew she was falling in love with him, and the knowledge terrified her. Her future remained uncertain, her debt to Parker hanging over her head like a storm cloud. To hope for anything permanent with Yancy seemed foolish, yet her heart refused to listen to reason. 2 days before Christmas, a blizzard swept down from the mountains, forcing everyone to remain indoors. The ranch hands stayed in their bunkhouse, while Ruth, Yancy, and Mrs. Abernathy, who had elected to remain at the ranch until the weather cleared, kept to the main house. That evening, after Mrs. Abernathy had retired early, complaining of rheumatism in her joints, Ruth and Yancy sat before the fire in the main room. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside was warm and snug. "I have something for you," Yancy said suddenly, setting aside his book. "An early Christmas gift. Wait here." He disappeared upstairs, returning moments later with a carefully wrapped package. "I wasn't sure when to give this to you, but tonight seems right." Ruth set her embroidery aside and accepted the package with curious hands. It was rectangular and surprisingly heavy. She unwrapped it carefully to reveal a wooden box, beautifully carved with a pattern of wildflowers. "Open it," Yancy urged softly. Inside, nestled in velvet lining, was the most exquisite set of embroidery tools she had ever seen. Silver needles of varying sizes, tiny scissors with ornate handles, a silver thimble and threads in dozens of colors, all arranged with perfect precision. "Yancy," she breathed, running her fingertips over the treasures. I can't accept this. It's too much." "It was my mother's," he explained. "She loved fine needlework, though she rarely had time for it with all the demands of the ranch. I had it sent from Denver after I saw how your skills were returning." Tears pricked at Ruth's eyes. The gift represented not just expensive tools, but his belief in her ability to reclaim what she had thought lost forever. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll treasure it always." "There's something else," he said, his voice taking on an unusual nervousness. "In the bottom compartment." Ruth slid open a small drawer she hadn't noticed and found a folded piece of paper. Opening it, she saw it was a bank draft made out to Elliot Parker's bank for the sum of $520. She stared at it in shock. "Yancy, what is this?" "The balance of your debt," he said simply, "plus interest. But why? How?" She could barely form coherent questions. He moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking her scarred hands in his much larger ones. "I can't bear the thought of you living in fear of Parker or being forced into another contract when this one ends. The cattle sales were good this year and I had savings. I can afford it." "I can't let you do this," she protested, though her heart pounded with hope. "It's too much to accept." "It's not charity, Ruth," he said firmly. "Consider it an investment, if you like, in your future, a future that I—" He paused, then continued with newfound determination. "A future that I hope might include me." Ruth's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that these past months have shown me what was missing in my life. You've brought warmth back to this house, purpose beyond just surviving season to season." His thumbs traced gentle circles on her palms, mindful of her scars. "I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you, Ruth Wilson. And if you could find it in your heart to consider a future here, not as an employee but as your wife," she whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Yes," he confirmed, his blue eyes steady on hers. "Though I know it might seem sudden, or that you might worry I feel obligated because of your situation. But it's not that. It's simply that I can't imagine this place my life without you anymore." Tears spilled freely down Ruth's cheeks now. "Oh, Yancy. I've been fighting my feelings for you, convinced that someone like me, scarred, in debt, contracted, could never be more than a burden to you." "Never a burden," he corrected gently. "A blessing, the greatest one I never expected." He reached up to brush away her tears. "I don't need an answer tonight. Think about it. The debt is cleared regardless of your decision. You're free, Ruth. Whatever you choose, you're free." The realization washed over her like a warm wave. Free. After months of uncertainty, of fear, of cautious hope, she was free. And not just from Parker and her debt, but free to choose her own path forward. In that moment, looking into Yancy's earnest face illuminated by firelight, her choice was clear. "I don't need time to think about it," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I love you too, Yancy. I have for months." though I was afraid to admit it even to myself. Joy bloomed across his features. Truly, in answer, Ruth leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a gesture of certainty, of promise, of love freely given and received. His arms came around her, drawing her closer, and in that embrace she found the home she had been searching for all along. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, the blizzard outside seemed to have receded, though in reality it continued unabated. The world beyond the windows might still be wild and unpredictable, but within these walls they had found shelter in each other. "When?" Yancy asked simply. "As soon as the snow clears enough for the minister to reach us," Ruth replied, her heart fuller than she had ever thought possible. "I don't want to wait any longer than necessary to be your wife." He kissed her again, sealing their agreement with tenderness and promise. As the fire crackled and the wind sang its winter song outside, Ruth finally allowed herself to believe in the future taking shape before her, a future built on love rather than obligation, on strength discovered in weakness, on hands that, scarred though they might be, would never again labor in servitude but would work only for the life and home she chose freely. The blizzard that had isolated Broken Spur Ranch finally released its grip on the mountains 3 days after Christmas. The ranch hands spent long hours clearing paths between buildings and breaking trails to check on the cattle in the sheltered valleys where they wintered. As soon as the road to town was passable, Yancy sent Jamie to Cripple Creek with 2 important messages, one to the minister requesting his presence at the ranch, and another to be telegraphed to Denver, addressed to Elliot Parker's bank. Ruth spent those days in a state of quiet joy, still adjusting to the radical change in her circumstances. The bank draft remained in Yancy's safe until the roads cleared enough to send it, but the knowledge that her debt would soon be settled permanently lifted a weight she had carried for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to stand truly straight. Mrs. Abernathy, upon being told of their engagement, clapped her hands in delight. "I knew it," she declared. "Didn't I tell Samuel months ago that the master had that look in his eye, like a man who's found water after crossing a desert?" The ranch hands received the news with varying degrees of surprise. Samuel offered quiet congratulations, his dignified manner giving way to a rare, broad smile. Eduardo insisted on playing celebratory songs on his guitar that evening, filling the bunkhouse with lively Mexican melodies that drifted through the crisp winter air to the main house. The Jackson brothers seemed mildly confused but pleased, while young Jamie was openly thrilled at the prospect of festivities. 5 days into the new year of 1876, Reverend Michaels arrived from Cripple Creek, bundled against the cold and accompanied by his wife, who immediately took charge of preparing Ruth for the ceremony. "A bride needs something special, even for a small wedding, Mrs. Michaels insisted, producing from her bag a delicate lace veil. "This was my mother's, and I've lent it to many brides who needed a something borrowed. I'd be honored if you'd wear it." The simple ceremony took place in the main room of the ranch house at sunset. Mrs. Abernathy had decorated with pine boughs, and the few winter flowers she had managed to force into bloom in the kitchen window. The ranch hands stood in a respectful semicircle, freshly shaved and wearing their Sunday best, which in most cases meant simply their cleanest shirts and least worn boots. Ruth wore a dress of soft ivory wool that Mrs. Abernathy had helped her alter from one of the finer garments in Yancy's mother's trunk. The borrowed veil rested lightly on her dark hair, and in her hands she carried a small bouquet of dried flowers and evergreen sprigs tied with a blue ribbon, something blue, Mrs. Michaels had explained with a wink. Yancy waited for her before the fireplace, tall and handsome in a black suit that Ruth suspected had rarely been worn. The look in his eyes as she walked toward him, wonder mixed with pride and deep, abiding love, would stay with her always. Reverend Michaels spoke of commitment and partnership, of weathering life's storms together, words particularly resonant for a couple who had found each other during times of hardship. When the time came to exchange rings, Yancy placed on Ruth's finger a band of gold that had belonged to his mother, while Ruth gave him a simple silver band that Samuel had helped her commission from the silversmith in Cripple Creek. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend declared. "Mr. Caldwell, you may kiss your bride." Their first kiss as a married couple was brief but tender, mindful of their audience, yet filled with the promise of deeper intimacies to come. As they turned to face their small gathering of witnesses, Ruth felt a surge of gratitude for this unexpected life that had emerged from the ashes of her old one. The celebration that followed was simple but joyous. Mrs. Abernathy had prepared a feast. Eduardo played his guitar, and even the usually reserved Samuel led Ruth in a dignified dance around the cleared furniture of the main room. As the evening progressed, Ruth found herself watching Yancy across the room, still amazed that this good, strong man was now her husband. Later, when their guests had departed and the ranch hands had returned to the bunkhouse, Yancy led Ruth upstairs, not to her old room, but to the master bedroom, which had been his alone until now. He had clearly prepared for this moment. The room was warmed by a crackling fire, and fresh linens adorned the large bed. On the dresser stood a vase containing a single winter rose, its white petals glowing in the firelight. "Where did you find that?" Ruth asked in wonder, touching the delicate flower. "Greenhouse in Denver," Yancy admitted. "Jamie brought it back with the minister. I wanted something beautiful for tonight." He paused, suddenly looking uncertain. "Ruth, I want you to know, there's no rush for anything. We have all the time in the world now." She understood his concern. Despite their feelings for each other, physical intimacy was new territory for them both. Ruth had never been with a man before, and she knew her scarred hands made her self-conscious about her body in ways she couldn't fully articulate. In answer, she reached up to touch his face, letting her fingertips trace the strong line of his jaw. "I'm not afraid, Yancy. Not with you." Their first night together was a revelation, tender, sometimes awkward, but ultimately a joyful discovery of each other. Yancy's hands were gentle on her scarred skin, his touch reverent rather than pitying. In his arms, Ruth found herself not diminished by her injuries, but somehow made more whole through his acceptance of every part of her. As winter gradually yielded to spring, Ruth settled fully into her role as mistress of Broken Spur Ranch. The bank draft had been sent to Parker's Bank in Denver, accompanied by a letter composed by Ruth that formally terminated any claims he might have against her. His reply had been terse but final, acknowledging receipt of payment and closing her account. By April, the snow had retreated to the highest peaks, and new grass carpeted the pastures. Calving season kept Yancy and the ranch hands busy from dawn until dusk, but the evenings belonged to the newlyweds, who were still discovering the rhythms of married life. Ruth had taken over management of the household accounts entirely, applying her sharp mind for numbers to finding efficiencies that increased the ranch's profitability. She had also expanded her embroidery business, receiving commissions from as far away as Denver for her distinctive work, which incorporated local wildflowers and mountain scenes into traditional patterns. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant peaks gold and crimson, Ruth turned to Yancy with determination in her eyes. "I want to learn to ride better," she announced. "Not just well enough to get to town and back, but really ride. To see the whole ranch, to go up into the high meadows with you." Yancy smiled, clearly pleased by her interest. "Any particular reason for this sudden ambition?" Ruth's hand drifted to her midsection, still flat but harboring a secret she had confirmed with the doctor in town just days earlier. "I think our child should have two parents who know every inch of this land, don't you?" For a moment, Yancy seemed not to understand. Then comprehension dawned across his features, followed by pure, unrestrained joy. "A baby, Ruth, are you certain?" She nodded, laughing as he swept her into his arms, lifting her from her chair to spin her in a circle on the wide porch. "Careful," she protested through her laughter. "I may not be delicate, but I'd rather not be dizzy." He set her down gently, his hands remaining at her waist, his eyes searching her face. "When?" "Dr. Miller thinks late November, perhaps early December." She placed her scarred hands over his. "A Christmas baby, possibly." "Are you happy about it?" he asked softly, always attuned to her feelings. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she assured him. "Though also a bit frightened. My hands. I worry about caring for an infant." "We'll manage," Yancy said with the quiet confidence that had first drawn her to him. "Together, and Mrs. Abernathy will help. She's already hinted that she'd like to move into the ranch permanently as she gets older. Said her sister's house in town is too cramped." Ruth leaned against his chest, content in the solid warmth of him. "I never thought I'd have this," she confessed. "After the fire, I believed that part of my life, marriage, children, a home of my own, was over before it began. Life has a way of surprising us," Yancy murmured into her hair. "Sometimes with fire, sometimes with snow, and sometimes with exactly what we need, just when we've given up hoping for it." The summer passed in a haze of activity. The cattle drive to the railhead went smoothly, bringing a handsome profit that Yancy immediately began reinvesting in improvements to the ranch. He hired additional hands to ensure that the work would be manageable as Ruth's pregnancy progressed, and commissioned the carpenter in Cripple Creek to build a cradle from the same golden pine that lined the nearby forests. Ruth's body changed gradually, her slender form softening as the child within her grew. Her scarred hands now rested often on her expanding belly, feeling the first fluttering movements that, as summer turned to fall, became more definite kicks and turns. True to her word, she continued to improve her riding skills, though as her pregnancy advanced, she limited herself to gentle rides on the most docile mare in the stable. Yancy accompanied her whenever possible, showing her the hidden corners of Broken Spur, the spring-fed pool where he had swum as a boy, the aspen grove where his father had carved his mother's name on a tree trunk long ago, the high ridge from which you could see clear to Pike's Peak on a clear day. In late September, a letter arrived that cast the only shadow on their happiness. It was addressed to Ruth, the handwriting unfamiliar but elegant. Inside was a newspaper clipping from the Denver Post, announcing Elliot Parker's recent appointment to the Territorial Banking Commission. A brief note accompanied it. "Mrs. Caldwell, I trust this finds you well. Your husband's payment resolved your financial obligations admirably. However, I find myself traveling to your region frequently in my new capacity and look forward to seeing how a woman of your limitations manages as a rancher's wife and mother. Cripple Creek is such a small community. I'm certain our paths will cross again. With regards, E. Parker." Ruth's hands trembled as she showed the letter to Yancy that evening. "He's threatening me," she said quietly. "Not directly, but the implication is clear." Yancy read the note, his expression darkening with each word. "He's a spiteful man," he agreed, "but you're not alone against him anymore. Whatever game he's playing, he'll find himself outmatched." Despite Yancy's reassurances, the letter left Ruth uneasy. Parker had no legal claim on her anymore, but his veiled threat suggested he hadn't forgotten or forgiven her for escaping his control. As October painted the landscape in russet and gold, Ruth threw herself into preparations for the baby's arrival. She embroidered delicate gowns and blankets, each stitch placed with love despite the occasional stiffness in her fingers. Mrs. Abernathy moved permanently into the small bedroom at the back of the house, her presence a comfort as Ruth's time grew nearer. The first snow fell in early November, earlier than usual, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Ruth stood at the window of what had become the nursery, watching the lazy descent of snowflakes and feeling the strong movements of the child within her. "Active today," she commented as Yancy joined her, his arms encircling her from behind, hands resting on her rounded belly. "Takes after his mother," he teased, feeling a particularly forceful kick against his palm. "Or her father's stubbornness," Ruth countered with a smile. Their gentle debate about whether they would welcome a son or daughter had become a familiar ritual. As Ruth entered her final month of pregnancy, Parker made good on his implied threat to visit Cripple Creek. Word reached the ranch that he had taken rooms at the hotel, ostensibly to meet with local business owners about banking regulations. But Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that his presence had more to do with her than any official business. Her suspicion was confirmed when Parker appeared at the general store while Ruth was selecting yarn for a new project. Mrs. Abernathy had accompanied her to town, but had stepped next door to the apothecary, leaving Ruth momentarily alone when Parker approached. "Mrs. Caldwell," he greeted her, removing his hat with false courtesy. "You're looking maternal." Ruth straightened her spine, one hand instinctively moving to protect her swollen belly. "Mr. Parker, I understood your business was with the bankers, not the merchants of Cripple Creek." "I make it my business to know all aspects of the communities I serve," he replied smoothly. His eyes dropped to her scarred hands. "Still creating your little embroideries, I see. Quite remarkable given your condition." "My hands serve me well enough," Ruth replied evenly. "As does my husband." Parker's smile tightened. "Yes, your fortunate marriage. Tell me, does Mr. Caldwell ever regret his investment? $50 for damaged goods plus the $500 to clear your debt. Quite a price for a ranch wife." The calculated cruelty of his words struck Ruth like a physical blow, but she refused to show weakness. "My husband considers it the best bargain he ever made, Mr. Parker. But then, he's a man who recognizes true value, not just ledger entries." Parker leaned closer, his voice dropping to ensure only she could hear. "I could have had that contract voided, you know. A woman with your injuries sold as a laborer, fraudulent on its face. You'd have been back in Denver, back under my thumb, if I hadn't decided to be merciful." "Is that why you're here?" Ruth asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "To remind me of your mercy, or to see if you can still intimidate me now that I'm no longer in your debt?" His eyes narrowed. "Perhaps I'm simply curious to see how long this frontier fairy tale lasts. Winter is hard in the mountains. Babies are fragile. Accidents happen." Before Ruth could respond to this thinly veiled threat, Mrs. Abernathy returned, her cheerful greeting faltering as she sensed the tension between Ruth and the well-dressed stranger. "Mrs. Abernathy," Ruth said, her voice remarkably composed given the hammering of her heart. "This is Mr. Parker from Denver. He was just leaving." Parker replaced his hat, offering a stiff bow. "Indeed I was. Good day, ladies. Mrs. Caldwell, I'm sure we'll meet again before I depart." As he walked away, Mrs. Abernathy frowned after him. "Who was that unpleasant man, and why was he bothering you?" "Someone from my past," Ruth replied, unconsciously rubbing her scarred hands together. "Someone I had hoped was finished with me." That evening, Ruth told Yancy about the encounter, recounting Parker's veiled threats with as much accuracy as she could. Yancy's reaction was controlled but intense, his jaw tight with anger. "He won't come near you again," he promised. "I'll speak to the sheriff tomorrow." "What can the sheriff do?" Ruth asked. "Parker hasn't broken any laws, he only implied." "Threatening a pregnant woman is enough," Yancy insisted. "Sheriff Davis is a reasonable man. He'll keep an eye on Parker while he's in town." Ruth wasn't convinced but didn't argue. The confrontation with Parker had exhausted her, and a dull ache had settled in her lower back. She retired early but found sleep elusive, her mind replaying Parker's words and struggling to dismiss them as empty threats. The following morning, Yancy rode into town while Ruth remained at the ranch, the discomfort in her back having spread to occasional twinges that wrapped around her abdomen. "Mrs. Abernathy watched her with knowing eyes as Ruth paused repeatedly in her tasks, one hand bracing against whatever surface was nearest. "That baby's making plans to join us," the older woman observed. "Might be sooner than you thought." "It's too early," Ruth protested. "Doctor Miller said another 2 weeks at least." Mrs. Abernathy chuckled. "Babies don't read calendars, my dear, and first ones often come when they please." By midday, Ruth could no longer deny that her labor had begun. The snow that had been threatening all morning began to fall in earnest, adding to her concern. Yancy had not yet returned from town, and if the snow continued at this rate, the roads would soon become difficult to travel. "We need to send one of the hands for the doctor," Ruth decided, grimacing through another contraction. Mrs. Abernathy nodded, already moving toward the door. "I'll have Eduardo ride out. He's the best horseman and his mare is steady in snow." Within minutes, Eduardo was on his way to town, bundled against the increasingly heavy snowfall. Ruth was settled in the bedroom she shared with Yancy, the fire built up to keep the room warm against the gathering storm outside. The afternoon stretched into evening with no sign of either Eduardo or Yancy. Ruth's labor progressed steadily, the contractions growing stronger and closer together. Mrs. Abernathy proved herself experienced in childbirth, keeping Ruth as comfortable as possible and monitoring the baby's progress with calm efficiency. "You're doing fine," she assured Ruth after checking her progress. "Everything's as it should be, just taking its time, as first babies often do." Ruth gripped the bedsheet as another contraction seized her. "Yancy should be here by now. What if something's happened?" "Nothing's happened except a snowstorm," Mrs. Abernathy said firmly. "Men are sensible enough to take shelter when needed. He'll be here when he can." As darkness fell completely, the wind rose to join the snow, howling around the eaves of the house and rattling the windows. Ruth's labor intensified, each contraction requiring all her concentration to breathe through. "I need to push," she gasped finally, feeling an overwhelming pressure that demanded release. Mrs. Abernathy checked her again and nodded. "The baby's ready. With the next pain, bear down as hard as you can." Ruth had thought she understood pain after the fire that scarred her hands, but the intensity of childbirth was something entirely different, not just physical but primal, a force that consumed her entirely and demanded complete surrender. She pushed with all her strength again and again, barely hearing Mrs. Abernathy's encouragements through the roaring in her ears. And then, suddenly, release followed by the most miraculous sound she had ever heard, the angry, indignant cry of a newborn taking its first breath. "A boy, Mrs. Abernathy announced triumphantly, quickly wrapping the squalling infant in the soft blanket Ruth had embroidered for this moment. "A fine, healthy son." Ruth reached for her child with trembling arms, her exhaustion forgotten as she gazed down at the red, wrinkled face of her son. His eyes were tightly shut, his tiny fists waving in protest at his abrupt entry into the cold world, but to Ruth he was perfect, a miracle born of love and hope. "Hello, little one," she whispered, her scarred fingers gently stroking his downy head. "We've been waiting for you." Mrs. Abernathy efficiently completed the necessities of the birth, while Ruth counted fingers and toes, marveling at the perfection of this new life she and Yancy had created together. As the older woman helped her into a clean nightgown and changed the bedding with practiced ease, Ruth's thoughts returned to her absent husband. "He should be here," she murmured, worry creeping back now that the immediate demands of birth had passed. Something must have delayed him. "The storm, likely," Mrs. Abernathy reassured her. "He'll have taken shelter in town rather than risk the journey. Same for Eduardo and the doctor." The howling of the wind seemed to confirm her words. Outside, the snow continued to fall, driven into drifts by the relentless wind. The ranch was isolated now, cut off from town until the storm passed. Ruth settled back against the pillows, her son nestled securely against her chest. Despite her worry for Yancy, a profound peace had settled over her. This child was living proof of second chances, of life's ability to bring beauty from ashes. Whatever Parker's threats, whatever challenges might lie ahead, this moment, this perfect, quiet moment of mother and child was a victory in itself. She must have dozed, for she woke with a start to the sound of voices below, deep, male voices that sent a surge of relief through her. Yancy had returned. Moments later, the bedroom door opened, and there he stood, snow still melting in his hair and beard, his face lined with exhaustion but transformed by wonder as his gaze fell on Ruth and the bundle in her arms. "You're here," she whispered, tears of joy springing to her eyes. "I was so worried." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, kneeling beside the bed to look in amazement at his sleeping son. "I got caught in town when the storm hit," he explained, his voice rough with emotion. "Tried to leave anyway, but the sheriff stopped me, said I'd freeze before I made it halfway home." "The sheriff was right to stop you," Ruth said, though she understood his desperation to reach her. "We managed just fine, didn't we?" She looked down at their son. "Mrs. Abernathy was wonderful." "A boy?" Yancy asked, carefully touching the infant's tiny hand. "Yes, your son." Ruth shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket so Yancy could see the baby's face more clearly. "I thought we might name him William, after your father. William Samuel Caldwell." "It's perfect," Yancy agreed, his voice hushed with awe. "He's perfect." He leaned forward to press a gentle kiss to Ruth's forehead, then to the top of his son's head. "I have news," he said, his expression turning more serious. "Parker left town yesterday. Left, but the storm. He departed before it hit, rather suddenly, according to the hotel owner." Yancy's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Seems he received an urgent telegram from Denver, something about irregularities in his bank's accounting practices being investigated by the territorial governor." Ruth's eyes widened. "How convenient, isn't it?" Yancy agreed, his smile broadening. "I might have sent a few telegrams of my own after our discussion. To friends in Denver who remember how Parker conducted business there. Friends who have the governor's ear." "You didn't," Ruth breathed, caught between shock and admiration. "I merely suggested that a thorough examination of Parker's books might be enlightening," Yancy replied innocently. "Whether anything comes of it, the investigation alone should keep him occupied in Denver for quite some time, and away from Cripple Creek." Ruth laughed softly, careful not to disturb the sleeping infant. "Remind me never to make an enemy of you, Yancy Caldwell." "You couldn't if you tried," he assured her, his expression softening again as he looked at her and their son. "You're my heart, Ruth. You and William. Everything I do is to keep you safe and happy." Outside, The storm continued to rage, but within the walls of the ranch house, all was warmth and peace. Ruth shifted over in the bed, making room for Yancy to sit beside her. Together, they watched their son sleep, marveling at the miracle of his existence and the journey that had brought them to this moment. Ruth thought back to that day on the auction block, her scarred hands bound before her, hope a distant memory. She remembered Yancy's words, "Those hands will never work again," and how she had misunderstood his meaning. Not a condemnation, but a promise, that her hands would never again be tools for others' profit, never again be worked until they bled or broke. Now those same scarred hands cradled her son, created beauty through her embroidery, and reached for her husband with love rather than fear. They were still marked by her past, but those marks had become part of a larger story, one of resilience, of unexpected joy, of love found in the most unlikely circumstances. As the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, signaling the storm's end, Ruth looked up at Yancy with a heart full of gratitude and love. "Thank you," she said simply. He didn't need to ask what she meant. His hand covered hers where it rested on their son, scarred skin against weathered, both strong in their own ways, both capable of tenderness. "No," he corrected gently. "Thank you for teaching me that sometimes what seems broken is just waiting to be loved back to wholeness." William stirred between them, his tiny face scrunching up as he prepared to announce his hunger to the world. As Ruth adjusted her nightgown to feed him, Yancy watched with undisguised wonder, his presence a silent promise of protection and devotion. Outside, the world was transformed by the storm, familiar landscapes made new under a blanket of pristine white. Inside, a family had been born not just through the arrival of William, but through the union of two souls who had found in each other the courage to trust again, to hope again, to love without reservation. And as the sun rose higher, illuminating the snow-covered peaks surrounding Broken Spur Ranch, Ruth knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, her hands, her heart, and her future secure in the life she and Yancy were building together. 5 years passed, transforming Broken Spur Ranch from a profitable but modest operation into one of the most respected in Colorado territory. Under Yancy and Ruth's joint management, the ranch had expanded its holdings, improved its breeding stock, and diversified into horse breeding as well as cattle. The main house had been enlarged to accommodate their growing family. William had been joined by a sister, Elizabeth, 3 years later, and Ruth was now carrying their third child. Ruth's embroidery business had likewise flourished, her distinctive design sought after throughout Colorado and even as far as San Francisco. She had taken on 2 apprentices, young women from Cripple Creek, who came to the ranch 3 days a week to learn her techniques. The scarring on her hands remained, but the pain had largely subsided, and she had developed methods to work around the remaining stiffness. Elliot Parker had indeed faced investigation following Yancy's telegrams, though he had managed to avoid serious consequences through his political connections. He had not, however, returned to Cripple Creek, apparently finding more pressing business elsewhere in the territory. On a golden autumn afternoon, Ruth sat on the expanded front porch, watching William help Yancy and Samuel with the horses in the corral while Elizabeth played with her wooden blocks nearby. Ruth's embroidery hoop rested on her growing belly as she took a rare moment of rest. "Mama, look," William called, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "I'm brushing thunder all by myself." Ruth waved acknowledgement, smiling at the pride in her son's voice. At 5, William was the image of his father, same determined jaw, same thoughtful blue eyes, Same innate kindness that showed in his gentle handling of animals and his protective attitude toward his younger sister. "He's a natural horseman," Samuel observed, climbing the porch steps to join Ruth. The years had whitened his hair completely, but he remained as dignified and capable as ever. "Got his father's way with the animals. And his father's stubbornness," Ruth added with affection. "Once he sets his mind to something, there's no dissuading him." Samuel chuckled. "A useful trait in these parts, long as it's tempered with good sense." He settled into the chair beside her, his gaze moving to Elizabeth, who was constructing an elaborate structure with her blocks. "That one now, she's got your eye for design. Been watching her arrange those blocks, always has to be just so." Ruth nodded, pleased by the observation. At 2, Elizabeth already showed signs of artistic inclination, carefully sorting her blocks by color and creating patterns that showed remarkable symmetry for her age. "How are you feeling?" Samuel asked, his tone shifting to gentle concern. "Not pushing yourself too hard, I hope." "I'm well," Ruth assured him. "This one seems easier than the others, so far at least." Samuel nodded, satisfied. He had become something of an uncle to their children, his initially reserved manner giving way to genuine affection as he watched them grow. Ruth suspected that his own history, which he rarely discussed, but which she knew included the loss of a family during slavery, made the children's acceptance of him all the more precious. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a wagon on the main road, an unexpected sight given that they weren't expecting deliveries or visitors. Ruth shaded her eyes, trying to identify the driver as the wagon drew closer. "It's Dr. Miller," she realized, recognizing the elderly physician who served Cripple Creek and the surrounding ranches. "I wonder what brings him out this way." Samuel rose. "I'll see what he wants. No need for you to get up." As he descended the steps to meet the approaching wagon, Ruth called to Yancy, who had also noticed the unexpected arrival. He lifted William down from the mounting block where he had been brushing the horse and strode toward the house, his expression curious but unconcerned. Dr. Miller brought his wagon to a halt and climbed down stiffly, his medical bag in hand. He exchanged brief words with Samuel before continuing to the porch, where Ruth and Yancy now waited. "Doc," Yancy greeted him. "Didn't expect to see you until next month for Ruth's checkup." The doctor's weathered face was grave. "I'm not here on a medical call, Caldwell. I'm afraid I bring news from town. Bad news." Ruth's hand instinctively moved to her belly, a protective gesture. "What's happened?" "Elliot Parker is back in Cripple Creek," the doctor said bluntly. "Arrived yesterday, but that's not the worst of it. He's brought marshals with him, federal marshals with papers claiming fraud in your contract transfer 5 years ago." Ruth felt the blood drain from her face. "That's impossible. Everything was legal. Yancy paid my contract in full and then settled my debt directly with Parker's bank." Dr. Miller nodded. "I know that. Sheriff Davis knows it too. But Parker's claiming the original auction was fraudulent, that selling a woman with your injuries for manual labor was misrepresentation, which invalidates the subsequent transfer and all transactions based on it." "That's absurd," Yancy growled. "If the auction was fraudulent, the fault lies with the auctioneer and whoever arranged the sale, not with Ruth, and certainly not with me." "I don't disagree," the doctor said. "But Parker has powerful friends in Denver now. He's managed to convince a federal judge to issue these papers. The marshals are planning to come out here tomorrow to take Ruth back to Denver for a hearing." Ruth clutched Yancy's arm, suddenly dizzy with fear. "They can't separate me from my children, from my husband. I'm pregnant, for God's sake." "Sheriff Davis is doing what he can to delay them," Dr. Miller continued. He sent me out here to warn you because he doesn't trust Parker not to try something underhanded. Said to tell you he can probably hold them in town until morning, but no longer than that." Yancy's face had hardened into an expression. Ruth recognized the look he wore when facing a threat to what he loved. "Thank you for the warning, Doc. We'll handle it from here." The doctor hesitated. "Caldwell, these are federal marshals. You can't just—" "I know exactly what I can and can't do," Yancy interrupted. "And I know right from wrong, even if some judge in Denver's forgotten the difference." After Dr. Miller departed, Yancy gathered the ranch hands to explain the situation. Their reactions ranged from disbelief to outrage, but all immediately offered their support, whatever form it might need to take. "We could fight," Jamie suggested, no longer the green youth he had been when Ruth arrived, but a capable young man of 25. "6 of us against 2 marshals, against 2 federal marshals with legal papers," Samuel corrected grimly. "That's not a fight, it's suicide, or at best, a ticket to prison for all of you." "Samuel's right," Yancy agreed. "We're not going to fight the law. But we're not going to let them take Ruth either." "Then what?" Eduardo asked, his normally cheerful face solemn. "What can we do?" Yancy looked at Ruth, his decision already made. "We leave, tonight. All of us, Ruth, the children, and me, leave Broken Spur." Ruth echoed, stunned by the suggestion. This ranch was their home, built by Yancy's own hands, expanded through their joint efforts. It represented not just their livelihood but their shared history. "Just until this is resolved properly," Yancy clarified. "We have friends in Wyoming Territory, Dan and Margaret Sullivan. Their ranch is 3 days' hard ride north of here. Parker's influence doesn't extend that far." "But the ranch," Ruth protested, "is just land and buildings," Yancy finished firmly. "You and the children are what matter. Samuel can run things while we're gone." The older man nodded. "You know I will, but they'll look for you, Yancy. Parker won't give up easily." "Which is why we'll take the high trail through Carson Pass," Yancy replied. "It's barely passable this time of year. No one would expect us to attempt it with children, especially not with Ruth expecting. But I know those mountains better than any marshal from Denver." The plan came together quickly after that. While Ruth packed essentials for herself and the children, Yancy and the hands prepared horses and supplies. They would travel light but warm, taking only what they could carry on horseback. Ruth would ride with Elizabeth, while William would share Yancy's saddle. Their departure was set for midnight, when the waning moon would provide just enough light to navigate the first stretch of trail. As darkness fell, Ruth moved through the house she had come to love, touching familiar objects, trying to memorize the feel of home. She had no way of knowing when or if they would return. The thought brought tears to her eyes, but she blinked them away. Now was not the time for sentiment, but for strength. In the children's room she found William wide awake, his small face serious in the lamplight. "Are we really leaving, Mama?" he asked. "Because of a bad man." Ruth sat on the edge of his bed, smoothing his dark hair. "Just for a little while, sweetheart, until things are sorted out. Think of it as an adventure. You'll get to ride with Papa and see new places. But why does the bad man want to take you away from us?" The simple question nearly broke her composure. How could she explain Parker's vindictiveness to a child? "Sometimes," she said carefully, "people get angry when they don't get what they want. This man wanted me to work for him a long time ago, but your father helped me instead. Now the man is still angry about that." William considered this, his young brow furrowed. "That's silly. You're Papa's wife and our Mama. You can't work for someone else." "That's right," Ruth agreed, swallowing the lump in her throat. "And we're going to make sure it stays that way." By midnight, their preparations were complete. The ranch hands gathered in the yard to see them off, each offering quiet words of encouragement or practical advice about the trail ahead. Samuel stood slightly apart, his expression composed but his eyes betraying his concern. "I'll send word when we've reached the Sullivans," Yancy told him, clasping his hand firmly. "If anyone asks, you don't know where we've gone, just that we left on urgent family business." Samuel nodded. "Be careful in those mountains, Yancy. Weather can change fast this time of year." "We will be." Yancy turned to Ruth, who stood nearby with Elizabeth drowsily clinging to her neck. "Ready," she nodded, accepting his help to mount the sturdy mare they had chosen for her. Elizabeth was settled in front of her, wrapped in warm blankets, while William was lifted up to sit before Yancy on his stallion. As they rode away from the brightly lit ranch house into the darkness, Ruth looked back once at the home they had built, at the life they might be leaving behind. Then she faced forward, toward the shadowed mountains that offered both danger and sanctuary. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, as they had faced everything since that day on the auction block when Yancy Caldwell had seen not just her scars, but the strength that lay beneath them. The journey through Carson Pass proved as difficult as Yancy had predicted. The trails were narrow and treacherous, winding through forests of pine and aspen, before climbing above the tree line into rocky terrain where the air grew thin and cold. They traveled by day and camped by night, making slow but steady progress northward. William, despite his youth, bore the hardships without complaint, his natural resilience and curiosity turning the grueling journey into an adventure. Elizabeth was less adaptable, often fretful and confused by the disruption to her routine, but she too gradually adjusted to their nomadic existence. For Ruth, the physical demands of the journey were compounded by her pregnancy. Morning sickness, which she had thought behind her, returned with a vengeance at the higher altitudes. Dizziness occasionally swept over her without warning, forcing them to stop while she regained her equilibrium. Yet she pushed on, drawing on reserves of determination she had first discovered in the aftermath of the fire. On the fourth day, as they descended from the highest point of their route, Ruth spotted movement on a parallel trail far below riders, at least 3, moving north along the main road they had deliberately avoided. "Yancy," she called softly, pointing. He pulled up his horse beside hers, following her gaze. "Marshals," he confirmed after studying the distant figures, "and Parker with them. They must have guessed we'd head north." "How did they know?" Yancy's expression was grim. "Someone in town must have talked. Or they found tracks despite our precautions. What do we do now? They're on the main trail to the Sullivan Ranch." "We keep to our route," Yancy decided. "It's longer but safer. By the time they realize we're not on the main road, we'll be far ahead of them." That night, camped in a sheltered hollow beside a small stream, Ruth woke to find Yancy sitting by the fire, his expression distant as he stared into the flames. "Can't sleep?" she asked, moving to join him. He made room for her on the fallen log he was using as a seat, wrapping an arm around her shoulders to share warmth. "Just thinking. About Parker, the marshals, about choices," he clarified. 5 years ago, I saw you on that auction block and made a choice that changed both our lives. I've never regretted it, not for a moment, but I never imagined it would lead to this." Ruth leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I never imagined any of it either. That day, I thought my life was over, that the best I could hope for was a quick end to my contract and then a lifetime of struggle." She looked toward the tent where their children slept. "Instead, I found everything I never dared dream of. And now we're fugitives," Yancy said softly. "Running from the law because a spiteful man can't accept that you escaped his control. I'd run 1,000 miles rather than be separated from you and the children," Ruth said with quiet intensity. "Whatever happens, Yancy, I want you to know that." Every hardship, every sacrifice, it's all been worth it for the life we've built together." He turned to look at her, firelight casting his features in sharp relief. "I promise you, Ruth, this isn't the end of our story. Somehow we'll find a way to stop Parker, to clear our names. Our children will grow up at Broken Spur, as they were meant to." The conviction in his voice steadied her, as it had so many times before. They sat together in companionable silence until the fire burned low, finding strength in their shared determination to protect what they had built. Dawn of the 6th day found them crossing into Wyoming territory, the border marked only by a weathered sign beside the trail. By nightfall, they had reached the Sullivan Ranch, a sprawling property nestled in a green valley, its buildings reminiscent of Broken Spur but on a larger scale. Daniel Sullivan, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a shock of iron-gray hair, greeted them with surprised welcome when they rode into his yard. His wife Margaret, a gentle-faced woman with shrewd eyes, immediately took charge of the exhausted children, whisking them inside for warm baths and hot food. Over a hearty dinner, after the children had been settled in bed, Yancy explained their situation to the Sullivans. Daniel listened gravely, his expression darkening as the tale unfolded. "This Parker sounds like a piece of work," he commented when Yancy finished. "Using federal marshals to pursue a personal vendetta that takes influence. Or money," Margaret suggested. "Judges can be bought, same as other men." "Either way, you're welcome here for as long as you need," Daniel assured them. "Wyoming's still wild enough that federal marshals don't come sniffing around much, especially not this far from the territorial capital." "We can't impose indefinitely," Ruth protested. "And the ranch will keep," Yancy finished. "Samuel's more than capable of running things until we return." "And you will return," Daniel said confidently. "I've got friends in high places too, including the territorial governor. Give me some time to write some letters, pull some strings. We'll get this Parker fellow's claims investigated properly." For the first time since they'd fled Broken Spur, Ruth felt a flicker of hope. Daniel Sullivan was not a man given to empty promises, and his connections throughout the Wyoming territory were extensive. "In the meantime," Margaret added, "you'll stay here as our guests. Ruth shouldn't be traveling in her condition anyway, certainly not with winter coming on." The weeks that followed brought an unexpected period of peace. The Sullivan Ranch became a temporary haven, its routines and rhythms gradually becoming familiar. William and Elizabeth blossomed under Margaret's grandmotherly attention, while Yancy found purpose helping Daniel with the daily operations of the ranch. Ruth, her pregnancy advancing steadily, divided her time between assisting Margaret with household tasks and working on a special embroidery project, a family portrait rendered in thread, depicting Yancy herself and their children standing before Broken Spur Ranch. The work was painstaking, each stitch placed with deliberate care, but the act of creation helped to focus her anxieties and maintain her connection to home. As promised, Daniel sent letters to his contacts throughout Wyoming and into Colorado. Replies trickled in slowly, bringing bits of news that he shared during evening gatherings around the fire. "The marshals searched Broken Spur thoroughly," he reported one night in late November. "Found nothing, of course, but they questioned Samuel and all the hands. Samuel told them exactly what we planned, that you left on urgent family business and didn't specify where you were going." "And Parker?" Yancy asked. "Apparently he's returned to Denver, at least for now. My source says he was furious when the marshals reported you'd fled before they arrived. Made quite a scene in the hotel in Cripple Creek." Ruth found some satisfaction in this image, though it was tempered by concern for those they had left behind. "Has there been any trouble for Samuel or the others?" None reported. The ranch continues to operate normally." Daniel hesitated, then added, "There is one piece of potentially good news. The judge who issued the original papers is being investigated for improprieties in several cases. It seems Parker's influence may be waning in Denver." "That could work in our favor," Yancy observed, "if the legal basis for his claims is undermined." "Exactly," Daniel agreed. "It's a waiting game now, but one that might end in your favor if we're patient." As November deepened toward December, snow began to blanket the valley, transforming the Sullivan Ranch into a winter wonderland that delighted the children. Ruth's pregnancy had reached its final month, and she found herself increasingly confined to the house, her body heavy and unwieldy as she awaited the birth. Margaret, who had raised 5 children of her own and assisted at countless births throughout the valley, assured Ruth that all was progressing normally. "This little one seems content to stay put until the proper time," she said one afternoon as they sat by the fire, Ruth working on her embroidery while Margaret knitted tiny booties. "Not like some who come racing into the world before anyone's ready." Ruth smiled, remembering William's dramatic arrival during a blizzard. "I'm grateful for that, and for your hospitality. I don't know what we would have done without you and Daniel." "Nonsense," Margaret dismissed the thanks with a wave. "You'd have managed. You and Yancy are 2 of the strongest people I've met, not in body, perhaps, but in spirit. It's why you're so well matched." The older woman's assessment warmed Ruth more than the fire beside them. She and Yancy had indeed drawn strength from each other throughout their ordeal, finding ways to reassure the children while concealing their own fears about the future. On the 15th of December, a fierce snowstorm swept across the valley, isolating the ranch house in a swirling white cocoon. The men spent the day checking on the livestock in the barns, while the women kept the children entertained with stories and games beside the blazing hearth. That evening, as the storm began to abate, Ruth felt the first stirrings of labor, subtle at first, then gradually intensifying as the night progressed. By dawn, she was in the throes of active childbirth, with Margaret calmly directing proceedings while Yancy paced anxiously in the hall outside. The labor progressed more swiftly than her previous deliveries, and as the winter sun climbed toward its zenith, Ruth gave birth to another daughter, a tiny, perfect being with a cap of dark hair and lungs that announced her arrival with impressive volume. "She's beautiful," Margaret pronounced, placing the swaddled infant in Ruth's arms, "and sturdy despite coming a bit early." Ruth gazed down at her newest child, overwhelmed by the familiar rush of love and wonder. "Yancy," she called softly, "come meet your daughter." He entered immediately, his face transforming with joy as he approached the bed. "Another girl," he marveled, touching the baby's tiny fist with a gentle finger. "She looks like you." "I think we should name her Margaret," Ruth suggested, smiling at the older woman who stood beaming nearby. "After the woman who has been like a mother to us these past months." Margaret's eyes misted with tears. "I'd be honored," she said simply. Later that afternoon, as Ruth rested with the baby, a commotion downstairs drew Yancy from his vigil at her bedside. He returned shortly, his expression a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. "A messenger just arrived from Cheyenne," he reported, "riding through the storm to deliver this." He held up an official-looking document bearing the territorial seal of Wyoming. "What is it?" Ruth asked, shifting little Margaret in her arms. "A formal recognition of our marriage and family by the territorial government, signed by the governor himself," Yancy explained, his voice tight with emotion. "And more importantly, a statement declaring that any contracts or legal proceedings originating in Colorado territory regarding your status are null and void within Wyoming's borders." Ruth stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "What does it mean?" "It means Parker can't touch you here," Yancy said, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. Daniel's influence with the governor was even stronger than he let on. This document essentially grants you protection as a citizen of Wyoming territory. "But what about Colorado? Broken Spur?" Yancy sighed. "That's more complicated. We can't return immediately. Parker's claims might still have legal standing there, but this gives us time and security while Daniel's other efforts continue. And it means our children are legally recognized as ours, beyond any challenge." Ruth looked down at the sleeping infant, then up at her husband. "We're safe then, at least for now." "Yes," he confirmed, reaching out to touch her face with tender fingers. "We're safe and together. That's what matters most." The winter passed in a blur of sleepless nights and peaceful days, as the family adjusted to their newest member. Little Margaret, called Maggie for simplicity, thrived despite her slightly early arrival, growing steadily and developing a serene personality that contrasted sharply with her siblings' more boisterous natures. Spring brought renewal to the Sullivan Ranch and fresh news from Colorado. Daniel's persistent inquiries had borne fruit. The judge who had issued the original papers against Ruth had been removed from the bench for corruption, and all of his recent rulings were under review. More significantly, Elliot Parker had encountered legal troubles of his own. The investigation Yancy had initiated years earlier had been revived, and this time, with the corrupt judge no longer providing protection, evidence of financial improprieties had been discovered in Parker's bank. "He's fighting the charges," Daniel reported as they gathered around the dinner table one mild April evening. "But my sources say it doesn't look good for him. Several prominent citizens of Denver have come forward with complaints about his business practices. What does it mean for us?" Ruth asked, bouncing Maggie gently on her knee. "Can we go home?" Daniel exchanged glances with Yancy before responding. "The situation is improving, but I'd advise caution. Parker still has resources and allies. Until his case is settled one way or another, returning to Colorado might be risky." Ruth's heart sank. Though the Sullivans had been unfailingly generous, she longed for Broken Spur, for the home she and Yancy had built together, for the life they had created there. William and Elizabeth, too, frequently asked when they could return, their memories of the ranch already taking on the golden hue of childhood nostalgia. "I've been thinking," Yancy said carefully, "that perhaps it's time for me to return alone, at least temporarily. To check on the ranch, to see Samuel and the Hands, to gauge the situation firsthand." "No," Ruth protested immediately. "We stay together. That was our agreement when we left." "Ruth's right," Margaret interjected. "Separating now could be dangerous. If Parker learned you had returned without your family, he might see it as an opportunity to pressure you through them." Yancy didn't argue, but Ruth could tell the idea remained in his mind. She understood his restlessness, his desire to reclaim what had been taken from them. She felt it too. But the safety of their children, now 3 precious lives depending on them, had to come first. Summer came to Wyoming, bringing long days of sunshine and the sweet scent of wildflowers to the valley. William, now nearly 6, spent hours helping Daniel with the horses, developing an expertise that impressed even the seasoned ranch hands. Elizabeth, at 3, shadowed Margaret in the garden and kitchen, her natural orderliness finding expression in helping to arrange flowers or set the table for meals. Maggie, at 6 months, was beginning to sit up on her own, her dark eyes taking in the world with solemn curiosity. In July, a letter arrived from Samuel that changed everything. In his precise handwriting, he reported that Elliot Parker had been convicted of fraud and embezzlement. The former banker faced a substantial fine, and 2 years in prison. More importantly, all legal actions initiated by Parker had been dismissed, including the claims against Ruth. "We can go home," Ruth whispered, looking up from the letter with tears in her eyes. "It's over." Yancy pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as the realization washed over them both. After nearly 9 months of exile, they could return to Broken Spur, to the life they had built, to the future they had planned. The journey back to Colorado was markedly different from their flight months earlier. They traveled by stagecoach rather than horseback, taking a longer but easier route through established towns and settlements. The children, excited by the prospect of returning home, found the journey an adventure rather than an ordeal. When they finally crested the ridge overlooking Broken Spur Ranch, Ruth's heart swelled with emotion. The buildings stood just as they had left them. The fields were green with summer crops, and cattle grazed peacefully in the distant pastures. It was as if time had stood still, waiting for their return. As their wagon rolled into the yard, ranch hands emerged from the barn and bunkhouse, their weathered faces breaking into grins of welcome. Samuel stood on the porch, his dignified bearing giving way to a rare, broad smile as he watched the family descend from the wagon. "Welcome home," he said simply, the words carrying all the weight of the months they had been gone. That evening, after the children had been settled in their own beds for the first time in nearly a year, Ruth and Yancy stood on the porch, looking out over their land in the gathering twilight. "It feels like a dream," Ruth said, leaning against Yancy's shoulder, "being back, knowing we can stay." "Not a dream," he corrected, his arm tightening around her waist. "A second chance. Again." She turned to look up at him, this man who had first seen her value when she stood scarred and hopeless on an auction block. "We seem to get a lot of those. Some people need more than others," he replied with a smile, "but I think we've made good use of ours." Inside the house, little Maggie began to cry, her voice carrying through the open window. Ruth straightened, ready to go to her daughter, but paused to press a kiss to Yancy's cheek first. "I never thanked you properly," she said softly, "for what you did that day in Cripple Creek. For saying those words that changed my life." He caught her hand before she could move away, his fingers gentle on her scarred skin. "Those hands will never work again," he quoted himself, his voice deep with memory. "Not for others. Only for what you love, for what you choose." "That was my promise then. It still stands now." Ruth smiled, squeezing his hand before turning to attend to their daughter. As she moved through the familiar rooms of their home, she trailed her fingertips along the walls, the furniture, the door frames, reconnecting with the life they had built and would now continue building, day by day, year by year. Her scarred hands might bear the marks of her past, but they had found their true purpose in creating a future filled with love, family, and the quiet, profound joy of coming home.